welcome to the second session. This time we're going to talk about why the Bible is so reliable. And remember, there were questions that we left you with at the last session that you need to think about as we go through the rest of the sessions. One of the questions is, as support for the conclusion that knowledge of the Bible's writers was from God and is reliable, why does the Bible state scientific, medical, and mechanical principles or facts at a time when the principles were authored, that is, at a time when the facts weren't known, by writers with no apparent scientific, medical, or mechanical background, or with experience contrary to the principle they state? They were authored centuries before disciplines were developed on which the accuracy of the principle could and would be measured. And they were authored apparently centuries before science and medicine, mechanics caught up with the principle stated. We're also going to go through again during this course with respect to the historical accuracy of the Bible, the fact that the Bible's historical facts were often long denied until they were recently substantiated archaeologically, and prophecies in the Bible were confirmed in the New Testament and by non-Christians. So, we have a timeline here that we're going to get into. Before we do that, there was a writer in the American Revolution who said the following, and I think is particularly appropriate here. It was Thomas Paine, who was one of the founding fathers of America. And what he said was, as of the age of reason and anti-Bible thinking, he said that to argue with a man who has renounced the use and authority of reason and whose philosophy consists in holding humanity in contempt is like administering medicine to the dead or endeavoring to convert an atheist by Scripture. In my view, we should be prepared to present evidence from Scripture which has proven to be true. All right, well, let's talk about this timeline. It's a shorter timeline than the one before. Remember, the first book of the Old Testament was written around 1450 BC, plus or minus, 1405 to 1450 BC. And the Old Testament was completed by 400 BC. That's kind of important when there are statements in the Old Testament that were only later proven. And then 96 AD was when the most recent New Testament book was written. So that is closer in time to the events it reports. That's a book written by John. Closer in time to the event it reports in other books, and we'll get into that. And then finally, we're going to get into science and archaeology really begins to grow in the mid-1800s. This is after all the time that had been spent denying the accuracy of the Bible. And as you know, once there is a thought put in somebody's head or a thought put in writing by somebody, it's going to be difficult for them to overcome that thought despite the evidence. And it's taken hundreds of years, and we still have people that don't believe the evidence and have not yet been able to overcome thoughts that were put in their head through the age of reason. Okay, so what is evidence? Evidence is facts weighed to see if, on balance, the facts should be believed. It's the probability as to the facts showing and that comes from their weighing. Now, while fact finders do not always reach the same conclusion as to what facts ultimately show, it is important for the fact finder to begin rationally and logically considering the facts when they're weighing evidence. If they're irrational, you're not going to get to a reasonable stopping point. We also need to remember that truth is true whether you believe it or not. Truth does not require belief in order to be true. And that's important. It's an important point to remember in our society today. Even without evidence, truth is truth. That's right. But we have plenty of evidence as to what the truth is. And then the third point is that one may exercise faith based on weight of the evidence. Faith is not Christian-branded hoping or wishing. Also need to remember that absolute proof is never required in a courtroom. Never. And so if somebody says to you, well, you can talk about your Bible all you want, but you can't absolutely prove this or that, and you start talking to them about how they weigh evidence, and there's different ways, and we'll talk about that. All right, what is not evidence? Speculation. Not evidence. And that's pretty much what the origin of species is all about. It's about speculation.
Yeah.
Feelings and suppositions. They also are not evidence. The fact that you feel a certain way doesn't prove a fact. It just proves an emotion that you're having at the time. Perceptions. They are closer to evidence, but they're not exactly evidence either. The way you translate a fact that you see is a perception. Your perception may be wrong, so that's not evidence. Conjectures, guesses, possibilities, that's not evidence. Hunches, gut feelings, beliefs, that's not evidence. Argument and conclusions, that is not evidence. Unproven and unsupported theories. You talk about evolution. It's an unproven and unsupported theory, and we'll get into why that is if we have time later on, but it is unproven. It's just a theory. All right. Now, there are three levels of evidence that we're going to talk about. One is the preponderance of the evidence. Again, I told you these first two sessions are going to be kind of geeky, but you want to be able to have a conversation with people you're talking to about what the evidence shows on the basis of these three levels of evidence. We'll show you what preponderance is. The second is clear and convincing evidence. That's a higher standard than preponderance, and we'll talk about that. And then beyond a reasonable doubt. In our courtroom system, that is the highest evidentiary proof, is beyond a reasonable doubt. So let's talk about preponderance. Preponderance is evidence that by the greater weight supports, or that is more likely than not to support, a fact or a factual conclusion. Doesn't mean it's 100%. It just means, as you can see from the scale, that your evidence is stronger by some measure than the evidence opposed to your evidence. Now, people can misunderstand that your evidence isn't in fact stronger. They may weigh the other guy's evidence more. But the idea is that the greater evidence of more than 50%, is a preponderance. Then there's the second level, it's called clear and convincing. Clear and convincing is more than a preponderance and less than reasonable doubt. It produces a firm belief or conviction without hesitation. It is highly probable proof of a fact. Then the final level is beyond a reasonable doubt. That's used primarily in our justice system in criminal cases. It is proof of such a convincing character that you would be willing to rely on it and act upon it unhesitatingly in the most important of your own affairs. It's not merely possible doubt or speculative, imaginary, or forced doubt. And then, to prove reasonable doubt does not require absolute proof. So we need to keep that in mind. Now, how do you apply standards of proof? First, you consider the evidence. And we're going to talk about evidence today. You set aside preconceived notions. And we all have them. You have to, when you consider evidence, try to do it with a clean slate, without a preconceived notion, because that preconceived notion will drive the way you consider the evidence. The third thing is You have to focus on the facts as they are presented, not on the facts from outside of the presentation, but as they are presented, to you. And then you have to reach a conclusion based on the evidence without considering what the reader thinks is a dominant opinion. That is, avoid groupthink. There's a lot of groupthink going on in our society today. People are saying things just because other people say things and because they want to be, want to fit in. You have to avoid groupthink when you think about the evidence, and it's hard to set aside preconceived notions, but you should do that. Okay, now why is the Bible reasonable? We'll get into that, but there are some false assumptions that which evidence disputes. One assumption is that Jesus never lived. Another assumption is you can't prove God exists. Another assumption is there's no such thing as miracles. Another assumption is there's no evidence Jesus rose from the dead. And there's no evidence that the Bible was not written until hundreds of years after Jesus lived. You're going to be able to overcome all of these. Now, proofs of the general reliability of the Bible. There are a number of proofs of the general reliability, and we talked about some of them. There's been careful copying of the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. We'll get into some of that, but also the New Testament. There are thousands of eyewitnesses to events that never come forward and say that what was said in a book was inaccurate. There are apostles' testimony that was given when they were dying. You've heard of a dying declaration? Well, that certainly is one. Archaeological discoveries, historical and historians, and modern science. Okay. Now, you see on the board part of a chapter that I wrote where I took the books. It's in chapter 3 of the book, and I put them in date order by the books of the Bible as they appear in the Bible, and I also went through and put the books in date order. So that if you read something in a book, you can know when it was written, when it was said, and then if you can find proof of it well after that, you can know that there was some connection between why it was said and why it was later proven. The Old Testament's general reliability. Leviticus is the oldest Old Testament text ever read, and it was written around 1450 BC. And it was finally read in 2016 AD because it was so brittle that they were afraid to open it. They were afraid it would fall apart. But they came up with a method where they could read it without opening it. And then there are the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is really cool. The Dead Sea Scrolls, you've not heard about them. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, some Bedouin shepherds were exploring some caves in the Judean desert. And they came across these leather-bound books. And they were a lot of the Old Testament that had been put there. They don't know why. It might have been during the escape from Jerusalem in 70 AD. They don't really know why. But these books found in the Dead Sea Scrolls are really pretty cruel. So there are fragments in the Dead Sea Scrolls from every Old Testament book except for Esther. So they can compare those fragments with what the Old Testament says now, and they find that they were convincingly, accurately reproduced. The Dead Sea Scrolls predated the oldest Jewish text from which the Old Testament had been taken before, predated that text by 1,000 years. Closer to the time when they were written, more likely to be accurate. And after years of study, the conclusion was reached that the Dead Sea Scrolls were almost identical with the oldest Jewish texts from which the Old Testament had previously been derived. And that's valuable evidence that the Old Testament had been accurately and carefully preserved. They were able to conclude that the Old Testament canon existed prior to the 3rd century BC. That's pretty important, because even if you don't believe that the last book was written in 400 BC, they proved that the oldest text that they found was written before 300 BC, the 3rd century BC. And again, if that's proven now, you've still got the same argument to make if you can't get somebody to agree as to when the books were written. And they also concluded that prophecies in the Old Testament which foretold of Christ predated the birth of Christ and predicted such events as the rise of Persia, Greece, and Rome long before they occurred. That's pretty cool stuff, that all of this happened according to the way it was predicted. Now, the third thing is the Jewish scribes. These Jewish scribes wrote these books of the Old Testament one after the other, very, very meticulously. All materials had to be made according to very specific specifications and had to be made out of kosher animal skins. They had to use quill pens from only clean birds. But more importantly, each column of writing could have no less than 48 and no more than 60 lines, in keeping with the way the Old Testament had been written. Every letter had to have some space around it. The letters, words, and paragraphs had to be counted, and the document became invalid if 2 letters touched each other. So that makes it really important to be careful. And the middle paragraph, word, and letter had to correspond to those of the original document. So they were careful. Within 30 days of completion, an editor had to look at it, and he had to make the same comparisons. He had to count every letter and every word, compare it to the original. He had to look at the middle word on each page and make sure that it was the same as the middle word that had been copied on the manuscript. And the documents could only be stored in sacred places. And we don't know how the documents got into these caves, but up until the time that whoever took the documents put them in those caves, they were very carefully tended to. Then there is the Nutsi tablets. These are what the Nutsi tablets look like. They were a set of tablets that was cuneiform clay tablets, about 20,000 of them, that was found right before World War II at the ruins of Nutsi. And they were found 3,500 years after they were written. Now, the importance of these tablets is this. They contain customs that are referred to in the Bible. It tells of practices similar to those as in Genesis for the adoption of children. It talks about inheritance rights that were similar to those that the Jews used. It talked about marriage arrangements. It talks about the significance of the deathbed blessing, which, caused some problems in the Old Testament. It talked about sistership, where in agreements in which a man adopted a woman as a sister, even though she was a wife, caused her to enjoy better protection and a superior position when she also had the legal status of a sister. This was important. I mean, you know what happened to Abraham when he went into Egypt? He claimed his wife as a sister. Now, kind of wonder why he would do that. Well, these Nutsi tablets tell you why he did that. He did that because it gave her better protection under the law. Yeah. They reveal institutions, practices, and customs remarkably similar to those found in Genesis, including the custom of a sterile wife providing a slave girl for her husband so that he could have children, which Sarah did. So all of that proves that what is being said about the Jewish lifestyle actually happened, and happened throughout their society at the time. Then you've got all kinds of other artifacts. You've got artifacts, 2 silver plates that were believed to have been used in the 7th century BC, 2,700 years earlier than they were found, that had the priestly benediction from Numbers. This was 2,700 years before they were found. They were found in 1979. They were originally written over 3,000 years before the amulets were found. The silver plates said, "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace." It's the oldest biblical text ever found. And then there were Assyrian inscriptions that were found, lists of kings, and that sort of thing. Now, then there was the Cyrus cylinder. This is really pretty important because we know from the Bible that Cyrus allowed the Jews to go home and rebuild Jerusalem. And for a long time, historians said there was no king that ever did that. He never released his slaves. But the Cyrus cylinder talks about the fact that he did. The Cyrus cylinder was discovered in 1879 in the ruins of Babylon. And it, while 19th century skeptics had scoffed at the biblical claim that a king would allow captured people to return to their homes, the Cyrus cylinder confirms that it did happen. Then there's steels. They're called steels. They're spelled S-T-E-L-E. This is what a stele looks like. It's a large monument that has writing on it that tells you a story. And the Hebrew Bible records the Israelites and the Egyptians had significant interactions. Some people claim that that didn't happen. But in 1896, a huge 10-foot tall inscribed monument called a stele was discovered and recounted the victories of the ancient Egyptian pharaoh, Merneptah, who reigned from 1213 to 1203 BC. It's the clearest Egyptian reference to Israel that they found from an early point in time. And it confirms the chronology of the Bible as to when the people left Egypt and the fact that this Egyptian pharaoh invaded them hundreds of years later. There's a Moabite stone that talks about Mesha, the king of Moab, who is mentioned in the Bible. It was found in 1868. It corroborates stories in 2 Kings. It contains references to Yahweh. So that's interesting. It may also contain a reference to the house of David, because in 1994, part of it was translated to be the house of David. This is when a lot of historians thought that they were just a tribe wandering around. There's the Jerusalem Chronicle. Hezekiah's tunnel was proven in 1838. There are Lachish reliefs where stone carvings from the wall of the palace of Sennacherib depict the siege of the city of Lachish. So there's Lachish that is talked about in the Bible. There are other scrolls. There's a Tel Dan stele, which was discovered in the 1980s and 1990s, that described the unified kingdom of David and Solomon and described it as a regional power at a time when a lot of historians thought it was just a small tribe. There are many others, and we don't have time today to get into all of them. But let's talk about the New Testament reliability generally. You remember that the last New Testament book was written by 96 AD. Well, there were plenty of people around who could have recalled whether or not what was stated in those books. Most of those books were written before 50 AD, within 15 to 20 years after Jesus died. There were certainly people around that knew whether or not what was being said was truthful. And you don't find a single witness that says that the books were not accurate. Now, that plenty of people could have contested the writings And plenty of people could have pointed out the inaccuracies. But there is no ancient document where anybody points out the inaccuracies of the Bible. There is none. And then in chapter 3, you'll see a chart of ancient writings, what you need to consider. The author who wrote the book, the date it was originally written, the date of the earliest copy remaining. Remember, if something was written 2,000 years before the earliest copy, it's not going to be as reliable as something that was written 90 years or 100 years before the most original copy that you can find. And then you need to consider the time span between the original and the copy. Now, some of the people that you want to consider who are considered as having historical value are Aristophanes, Aristotle. I put a whole list up there. Homer, and then compare them to the dates of the New Testament, compare them to the dates between the original writing of a document and the closest one. And I've got a chart in chapter 3 of the book that tells you how close in time to its original a copy of a book exists. And you can make those own considerations yourself. Now, there are other reasons to consider besides the dates of writing after the original. I'll give you some names there. You might also consider that there are foreign writings, like Sun Tzu. He wrote The Art of War. It's considered by many to be historical, but yet the most recent copies are far after he wrote the original book. And there are others. There are the writings of Confucius, and all of these writings have been determined to have been written much earlier than the copies that they have. There are tens of thousands of early New Testaments, and all New Testament books written within 70 years of Jesus' death. And there are thousands of witnesses that could have said something. All right. There are examples of other documents written close to the time, and we can't go into them because I think we're going to run out of time here. But there were a number of writings that contain statements about Christianity, about Christ, about the resurrection, and that sort of thing that were found. Ryland's Papyrus was discovered in 1920, and it confirms much about the Bible. It contains a small fragment of the Gospel of John. There is the Bodmer Papyrus, which was discovered in 1982 in Egypt, which was dated from about 150 AD, and it contains most of John's Gospel. There's the Chester Beatty Papyri, discovered in 1931. It contains most of the New Testament. There is the Codex Vaticanus, which dates to 200 AD. It's in the Vatican. There's a Codex Sinaiticus dated to 350 AD that was discovered in 1859, and it contains a nearly complete New Testament and over half of the Old Testament. And the New Testament is more internally consistent than these other books that have been copied. They've been compared. And as copies go on with the other books, the content changes, but it doesn't change with the Bible. All right. Now, we talk about in the book about ancient non-Christians that confirmed the accuracy of the statements. You've got Titus Flavius Josephus, who was known as Flavius. He confirms that there was a Christian sect, and he talks about the fact that Jesus existed. You've got the destruction of the temple, proves that the Bible is accurate. You've got the historical trustworthiness of Luke. Luke was a physician. And you would think that a physician would be very careful in what he did. But for years, people thought that the book of Luke and the book of Acts was just made out of whole cloth. It was made up. But recent archaeologists have determined that, in fact, the book was as Luke wrote it, both books. Then you've got the eyewitness accounts. We can talk about some of these eyewitness accounts, and we will talk about them later. But the Bible is full of eyewitness accounts. They were eyewitnesses who lived with Jesus for 3 years, the apostles, and died horrible deaths. The eyewitnesses to Jesus' life in the New Testament were more than casual observers. There are other reasons to rely on the Old Testament. And then there were reliable early copyists of the Christian Bible. These were professional men who were paid by the line to copy the Bible. And if they were off by any amount, they wouldn't get paid. Now, most of them were non-Christians, but they were very careful in what they did. All right. There is other proof of the New Testament's reliability. There are more existing New Testament copies written closer in time to what happened in it than all other historical books. There are tens of thousands of New Testaments. There are maybe 1,000, 2,000 of these other books, and often much less. So when they rely on a book by, say, Homer, there's only 1,900 copies of it that they could look at as being old copies. The second thing was the New Testament's currency, that it is accurate, is regularly reconfirmed. As we talked about, it was reconfirmed when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and it was reconfirmed since that time. The third thing is the earliest New Testament script was dated to about 114 AD. That was pretty close to the time that all of this happened. And as I said, there were 20 to 25,000 New Testament early manuscripts, over 10 times the 1,900 manuscripts that they have of Homer from early on. That is our lesson for the second session. As I told you, it'd be kind of geeky. We're going to get into some fun stuff in the third session through the sixth session. We're going to get into where things are proven and how they are proven to be accurate. And I know that for those people that are at home, that you can't ask many questions, but if anybody here wants to ask a question, I'll be glad to answer it, and maybe they can pick it up on the tape.